Is that a toy rifle, old man? The voice cut across the firing range sharp enough to make half a dozen Marines turn their heads. I had heard that tone before. Young confidence wrapped in fresh uniform starch. I stopped just inside the gravel boundary of the sniper range and let the sound of boots crunching behind the firing line settle into the dry afternoon air. The desert sun sat high over the hills beyond Camp Dalton, heat rippling off the rocks and bending the horizon like glass in a furnace. A row of wind flags snapped and fluttered downrange, each one telling a slightly different story if you bothered to watch long enough. Most people didn't. Most people trusted the computers. The Marine who had spoken stepped closer, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of posture you get from years of carrying weight on purpose. Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Ramirez. I had seen his type across more decades than he had birthdays. His eyes dropped to the rifle slung over my shoulder, and the corner of his mouth curled upward. The rifle was painted a dull safety orange, the kind used on training ranges so nobody mistakes it for something operational. Against the sand-colored hills and the crisp camouflage uniforms around me, it looked ridiculous. Like a prop from a hunting catalog nobody took seriously. Ramirez tapped the barrel with 2 fingers. You planning to hunt traffic cones with that thing? A few Marines laughed. Not cruelly. Just the quick, careless laugh of men who thought they understood the situation. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked past them, out toward the mountains where the target sat somewhere beyond visible distance. 4,000 meters. Just over 2.5 miles. Far enough that the steel plate couldn't be seen with the naked eye from this line. The only proof it existed was the cluster of spotting scopes and the quiet frustration hanging over the range like dust. I had watched them for 15 minutes before stepping forward. 15 minutes of missed calculations, wind corrections that chased themselves in circles, and one expensive ballistic computer after another insisting the math was correct even when the bullet never came close. The air smelled like hot stone and gun oil. A thermal drift rolled slowly up the slope to the left, invisible to most of the shooters, but obvious if you knew where to look. I had spent most of my life noticing things like that. Ramirez folded his arms. Range is restricted today, sir. Sniper qualification exercise. Civilians aren't allowed on the line. I nodded once. I'm aware. My voice sounded older than it used to, but it carried well enough across the quiet. Another Marine, younger, maybe 22, leaned over his spotting scope and whispered something to the guy beside him. They both glanced back at my rifle. The orange paint caught the sunlight in a way that made it impossible to ignore. I slid the sling from my shoulder and rested the rifle gently on the wooden bench beside the firing mat. The metal had warmed from the walk across the range. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. You actually planning to shoot? No, I said calmly. I'm planning to watch the wind. That earned a louder laugh. Someone behind the scopes muttered, this ought to be good. Ramirez crouched down and lifted the rifle slightly, inspecting it like a mechanic examining a lawn mower that had rolled into a racetrack. The orange finish was scratched in places where the paint had worn thin over the years. Underneath it, the steel told a much older story. He tapped the receiver with a knuckle. You realize the target's sitting a little over 2.5 miles out there, right? Yes. And you brought a training rifle. I met his eyes then, not angry, not defensive, just steady. I brought the rifle that works. A breeze slid across the range from right to left, gentle at ground level, but stronger higher up where the slope funneled the air between 2 ridgelines. The flags downrange flickered in 3 different directions. Nobody seemed to notice. Ramirez chuckled and stood up, shaking his head as if the whole situation was entertainment. Tell you what, old-timer, he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the firing mat with a theatrical sweep of his arm. If you think that orange thing can do what 12 Marine snipers haven't managed all morning, be my guest. I looked downrange again, watching the shimmer of heat rising off the rocks 1,000 yards out, then another band of distortion much farther beyond that. The wind wasn't one wind today. It was 3, and none of their computers could see it. I did not move right away when Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez stepped aside and offered me the firing mat like it was a joke meant for the whole range. The laughter around me faded slowly, replaced by the quiet shifting of boots on gravel and the metallic click of someone adjusting a spotting scope. I had learned a long time ago that silence tells you more about a room than noise ever will. I picked up the orange rifle and carried it forward, the weight of it familiar in my hands even after all these years. It was not heavy, not compared to the rifles we used to carry through jungle ridges or frozen hillsides. This one balanced easily against my shoulder as I walked to the mat and lowered myself down onto the rough canvas surface. The desert ground radiated heat through the fabric, warming my elbows as I settled into position. Downrange, the mountains shimmered in the distance, layers of dusty blue stacked against the sky. Somewhere out there, 2.5 miles away, sat a steel target no larger than a dinner plate. I had not seen it yet, but I did not need to. I had seen enough targets like it in my lifetime to know exactly how small it looked when distance began to stretch the world apart. Behind me, one of the Marines muttered quietly, "This is going to be a waste of ammo." Another answered, "Just let him try." Gunny said it was fine. Their voices carried the casual certainty of men who trusted numbers more than instinct. I rested the rifle on the bipod and adjusted it slowly, feeling the small movements of the metal against the ground. The orange paint caught the sunlight again, and someone chuckled softly. Ramirez stood a few feet behind me with his arms crossed, watching like a referee waiting for the bell of a boxing match that had already been decided. "You know the wind call yet?" he asked. I did not look back. Instead, I lifted my eyes toward the first line of wind flags stretched along the valley floor. They snapped lightly to the left, maybe 3 miles per hour, maybe 4. But 100 yards farther out, the second flag leaned the opposite direction, slow and lazy, like it had a different opinion about the weather. "The wind is not the same all the way out," I said quietly. Ramirez gave a short laugh. "That is what the ballistic computer is for." I heard the faint tap of plastic as someone behind him lifted the small device strapped to their wrist. Modern shooters love those things. They fed the machine numbers, and the machine told them what the world should be doing. I had spent too many years learning that the world does not care what a computer expects. I leaned forward slightly and looked through the scope, but not at the target. Not yet. The glass showed me the heat waves dancing above the rocks halfway downrange. Mirage shimmered in narrow ribbons, drifting sideways across the slope before rising into the sky. It told a different story than the flags. There was a canyon cut into the left side of the valley about 1,000 yards out. I could not see it clearly from here, but the movement of the mirage gave it away. Air rising through the stone like breath through a pipe. A thermal updraft. That was the second wind. The third one was farther out still, just below the ridge where the steel plate waited. That wind rolled downhill slowly, colder and heavier than the air rising from the valley floor. 3 winds moving in 3 directions across the same bullet path. Ramirez shifted behind me. "You planning to shoot sometime today?" I smiled faintly and reached up to adjust the scope. "I am planning to understand the wind first." One of the younger Marines snorted behind the spotting scopes. "At 4,000 meters, wind is the whole problem." "No," I said calmly, still watching the heat shimmer twist through the air. "At 4,000 meters, wind is the whole answer." The range had grown quiet again. Even the laughter had faded into curiosity now. I took a slow breath and let it out while the rifle rested steady beneath my shoulder. For a moment, I did not see the desert range anymore. I saw a different hillside from a long time ago, green instead of brown, humid instead of dry, but the wind had moved the same way there too. It always does. People change. Landscapes change. But the wind never really does. When I finally shifted the rifle slightly and aligned the scope toward the distant ridge, the Marines behind me leaned forward at the same time, their shadows stretching across the gravel as they waited to see what an old man with an orange rifle thought he was about to prove. I settled deeper behind the rifle and let the world narrow until it was just the scope, the wind, and the long, empty stretch of valley between me and the ridge 2.5 miles away. The Marines behind me had stopped laughing now, but the disbelief still hung in the air like heat rising from the gravel. I could feel it without looking back. Skepticism has a sound to it. Boots shifting, quiet murmurs, the soft tap of someone adjusting a spotting scope because they expected a show. I adjusted the rear bag beneath the stock and felt the rifle settle into a position that reminded my shoulders of another hillside many years ago. The orange paint on the barrel glowed bright in the sun, and I heard one of the Marines whisper, "That thing looks like it belongs in a safety briefing." Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez stepped a little closer behind me, his shadow stretching across the mat. "You realize nobody here has even touched that plate today," he said. "Not even close." His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had watched 12 trained shooters fail at the same problem. The computers say the shot is possible, he continued, but the margin for error is almost nothing. I kept my cheek against the stock and watched the mirage ripple across the valley floor. Computers see numbers, I said quietly. Wind does not care about numbers. A few of the Marines chuckled softly at that, but not as loudly as before. Curiosity had begun replacing amusement. I shifted the rifle a fraction of an inch to the right and adjusted the elevation turret slowly. Each click felt familiar, like the turning of an old dial that had never quite forgotten the hands that used it. The scope finally found the distant ridge line, and for the first time I saw the steel plate through the glass. It looked impossibly small at that distance, a faint square glint against the rock face that shimmered through layers of heat distortion. The wind flags near the firing line still snapped lightly to the left, but through the scope the mirage farther out bent the opposite direction. I watched it for several seconds, letting my breathing slow until the movement of the rifle matched the rhythm of the air moving across the valley. Behind me, one of the younger Marines spoke quietly. "Gunny, is he actually going to try it?" Ramirez answered without taking his eyes off me. "Looks like it." There was a pause. Then another voice said, "That rifle cannot even hold the velocity for that distance." I allowed myself a small smile. People like to talk about equipment. They like to believe the rifle made the shooter. I had spent enough years proving the opposite to know that the truth rarely impressed anyone until after the shot landed. The wind shifted again, just slightly, enough to change the way the mirage twisted above the rocks halfway to the ridge. I waited. Time stretched across the firing line, the desert quiet except for the distant hum of a vehicle somewhere beyond the hills and the faint snap of the range flags. Ramirez cleared his throat. "You know, old-timer, if you miss by even a couple yards at that distance, nobody will blame you." I kept watching the air through the glass. "I am not planning to miss." Another Marine laughed quietly, but it was not mocking anymore. It sounded almost nervous. I moved the rifle a final fraction of an inch and let the crosshair float slightly above the steel plate. Not directly at it. Above it and to the side, where the bullet would meet the third wind coming down from the ridge. My finger rested lightly against the trigger guard while I watched the valley breathe. The heat shimmer slowed for a moment as a cooler current slipped through the canyon below. That was the moment I had been waiting for. The window when the three winds lined up just long enough to send a bullet across 2.5 miles of open air without arguing with itself. I inhaled slowly and felt the rifle settle into my shoulder like it had been waiting there all along. Behind me the Marines had gone completely silent now. Even Ramirez had stopped talking. The entire firing line seemed to be holding its breath with me as the crosshair hovered over the distant steel plate. For a brief second the mirage flattened, the air turning almost still across the valley. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, I finally began to squeeze the trigger. I completed the slow pressure on the trigger the same way I had done thousands of times before, not pulling it, but letting the shot arrive on its own when the rifle and the wind finally agreed with each other. The recoil moved gently into my shoulder, a familiar push rather than a surprise, and the orange barrel lifted a fraction before settling back onto the bipod. The sound of the rifle cracked across the range and rolled out into the valley, bouncing once against the distant hills before dissolving into the desert air. After that, there was nothing but silence. At 4,000 meters, the bullet had a long journey ahead of it. I stayed behind the scope, watching the distant ridge through the wavering mirage while the Marines behind me shifted slightly, unsure what they were supposed to do next. Someone whispered, "Did he already fire?" Another voice answered, "Yeah, I think so." I kept my eye on the steel plate far beyond the valley. The bullet would take several seconds to cross that distance, longer than most people expected. Time stretches strangely when you are waiting for something that far away to decide whether you were right about the wind. I counted the seconds in my head the way I always had. 1, 2, 3. The mirage twisted again halfway across the valley as the second wind lifted through the canyon. For 5. The Marines behind me leaned closer to their spotting scopes. I could hear the faint rustle of uniforms and the quiet adjustment of tripod legs scraping lightly against the gravel. 6. Then the steel plate on the ridge twitched. It was small through the glass, barely more than a speck against the stone, but the movement was unmistakable. The plate swung backward and rang a faint metallic note that arrived long after the bullet had already done its work. A delayed echo, thin and distant, carried back across the valley like a bell heard through a storm. For a moment nobody spoke. Even the wind flags seemed to pause. I lowered the rifle slightly but stayed prone, letting the quiet settle over the firing line. Behind me, one of the Marines finally exhaled in a long breath he had probably been holding since the shot. "No way," he said softly. Another Marine leaned harder into his spotting scope. Did that actually hit? The range officer standing near the observation table was already checking the electronic tracker that monitored the distant target. The small screen flickered for a moment before displaying the impact marker from the steel plate sensor mounted on the ridge. He blinked at it, then looked up toward the mountain again as if the valley itself might argue with the data. Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez had not moved. I could feel him standing behind me, completely still, the same man who had laughed a few minutes earlier, now watching the ridge with a different expression. Finally he spoke, his voice lower than before. "Range control, confirm that reading." The range officer pressed a button on the console and waited. The radio on the table crackled with a distant response from the monitoring station positioned halfway up the mountain slope. "Impact confirmed," the voice said through the speaker. Target plate moved approximately 4 inches. Sensor registered the strike. A ripple of disbelief moved through the Marines on the line. Someone said, "That is 2.5 miles." Another answered quietly, "That is 4,000 meters." I slowly rolled onto one elbow and looked back toward them for the first time since the shot. A dozen faces stared at me now, the earlier amusement gone completely, replaced by something closer to stunned curiosity. Ramirez stepped forward and looked down at the orange rifle resting across the mat, as if it had somehow betrayed everything he believed about shooting. "You got lucky," one of the younger Marines muttered, though his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. I shook my head gently and glanced toward the valley again where the wind had already begun shifting across the rocks. "No," I said calmly. The wind got honest for about half a second. Ramirez followed my gaze out across the valley, watching the mirage twist again as the thermal current returned to the canyon. For the first time since I had walked onto the range, he did not laugh. He simply stared at the distant ridge where the steel plate was still swaying slightly in the desert sun, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. I stayed kneeling beside the rifle for a moment longer while the sound of the distant steel plate slowly faded into the desert air. The valley had already begun to move again, the wind flags snapping lightly, as if nothing unusual had just happened. That is the thing about the wind. It never stays impressed for long. Behind me the Marines were still staring through their scopes, some of them adjusting focus like they expected the target to suddenly explain itself. The range officer leaned closer to the monitor again, checking the numbers twice as if the screen might admit it made a mistake. I pushed myself up slowly and brushed the dust from my knees before lifting the orange rifle from the mat. The metal felt warm under my hand from the sun and the single shot it had just delivered across 2.5 miles of open air. Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez stepped closer now, not with the swagger he had earlier, but with the careful curiosity of someone who had just watched something he could not quite categorize. He looked at the rifle again, turning his head slightly, as if the orange paint might reveal a secret if he stared at it long enough. "That rifle should not be able to do that," he said quietly. I rested the butt of the stock against my shoulder and glanced out across the valley once more where the ridge line shimmered under the afternoon heat. "Most rifles can," I answered, "if the person behind it understands the air." A few of the Marines exchanged looks at that. The younger one who had doubted the shot earlier shifted his weight and finally stepped away from his spotting scope. "Sir," he said carefully, the words sounding different now than it had before. "Have you done that before?" I smiled faintly at the question. It was the kind of question people ask when they are trying to place you somewhere in their understanding of the world. I looked down at the rifle and ran my fingers along the worn section of the receiver where the orange paint had been scratched away over the years. Underneath the paint, the steel still carried a thin engraved line that most people never noticed. Ramirez noticed it. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned closer. "That mark," he said. "What is that?" For a second I did not answer. The warm desert air faded quietly from my senses, replaced by a memory of thick green hills and humid air that smelled like wet earth and diesel fuel. I had been 22 years old the first time. I carried a rifle across a ridge that looked almost exactly like the one sitting 2.5 miles away in front of us now. The rifle back then had not been orange. It had been dark walnut and steel, the kind of rifle that felt like an extension of your bones once you had carried it long enough. I could still remember the day that small line was carved into the metal. It had not been done in a workshop. It had been scratched there by the edge of a field tool while a friend laughed beside me and said every rifle that survives long enough deserves a scar to prove it. I blinked once, and the desert range came back into focus. Ramirez was still watching the mark on the receiver with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "That rifle older than you think?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Parts of it are." The younger Marine leaned forward again, curiosity pushing past whatever embarrassment he felt earlier. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" I looked back toward the valley again, watching the mirage dance above the canyon where the second wind still curled upward through the rocks. "Different valley," I said quietly. "Different time." Ramirez folded his arms again, but there was no mockery in his posture now. Only questions. "Military?" he asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I lifted the rifle and slid the bolt open to check the chamber before resting it across the bench. The simple mechanical motion sounded louder than usual in the quiet firing line. "A long time ago," I said finally. Behind us, the range officer was still talking into his radio, repeating the distance and the confirmed impact to someone farther up the chain who clearly did not believe what he was hearing the first time. The Marines on the line had stopped pretending the shot was luck now. They were watching me instead, not laughing, not arguing, just watching. And somewhere above the valley, far beyond the ridge where the steel plate still rocked slowly in the afternoon wind, the echo of that one impossible shot had already started traveling farther than any of them realized. The firing line remained quiet long after the radio conversation at the range control table ended, and that silence carried a different weight now than the one that came before the shot. Earlier it had been curiosity mixed with amusement. Now it was something slower and heavier, the kind of quiet that grows when people begin reconsidering what they thought they understood. I rested the orange rifle carefully across the wooden bench and ran a cloth once along the barrel more out of habit than necessity. The metal had cooled slightly in the breeze that drifted down from the ridgeline, but the afternoon sun still pressed warmly across the valley floor. Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez stood beside the bench now instead of behind it, his eyes still fixed on the rifle, as if the paint itself might answer the questions forming in his head. "You said parts of it were older," he said finally. "How old are we talking about?" I folded the cloth and slipped it back into the small pocket on my jacket before answering. "Older than the computers you all carry on your wrists." A few of the Marines shifted uncomfortably at that, glancing down at their ballistic devices. One of them cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, that shot should not have worked with that rifle." I looked at him and gave a small nod. Most people say that right before they learn something about the wind. The young Marine did not argue. Instead, he looked back toward the valley where the distant ridge shimmered in the heat haze. Ramirez reached out and gently lifted the rifle from the bench, careful this time, not the casual way he had tapped it earlier. He turned it slightly in his hands and studied the receiver again where the thin scratched line crossed beneath the worn paint. "This mark," he said slowly, "looks like a field scratch, not a factory engraving." I nodded once. "It is." He glanced up at me. "Where?" For a moment the range disappeared again. The desert wind faded and a different breeze replaced it in my memory, one that carried the thick smell of jungle rain and diesel generators humming somewhere beyond the tree line. The hills back then were greener, but just as steep as the ridge in front of us now. And the wind had been just as complicated. I could still see the young faces standing beside me on that ridge line. All of us barely old enough to shave every morning, but convinced we understood the world better than it understood us. One of them had taken a small multi-tool and scratched that thin line into the rifle, while laughing that any rifle that survived long enough deserved a scar like a soldier. I blinked, and the desert range returned again. Ramirez was still holding the rifle, waiting. "Different valley," I said quietly. "Long time ago." The Marines exchanged glances again. The younger one who had spoken earlier stepped forward slightly, curiosity overcoming the caution he had tried to keep in his voice. "Were you a sniper?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment. Labels have a way of oversimplifying things that took years to learn. Finally, I nodded once. Among other things, Ramirez lowered the rifle slowly back onto the bench, but kept his hand resting on the stock, as if grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened. The radio on the observation table crackled again, this time with a different tone of urgency. The range officer answered quickly and listened for several seconds before looking up toward us with an expression that made the Marines straighten instinctively. "Gunny," he said, "range command wants confirmation on the shooter." Ramirez frowned slightly. "Why?" The officer hesitated before answering. "Because that shot just triggered a system flag." The Marines around us looked confused, but Ramirez's expression changed immediately. He turned his head slowly toward me. "A system flag," he repeated. The range officer nodded and tapped the screen on the console. Distance, trajectory, sensor reading. The monitoring network logged the shot and cross-checked the profile. The desert breeze moved lightly across the firing line again, fluttering the wind flags and stirring dust along the gravel path. Ramirez studied my face now with the careful attention of someone realizing a story might be unfolding in front of him. "What profile?" he asked quietly. The officer hesitated again, glancing once more at the monitor before answering. "The kind they keep archived." The words hung in the air for a moment. I looked back toward the valley where the steel plates still swayed faintly in the sunlight 2.5 miles away. The wind had already shifted again, closing the narrow window that made the shot possible. And somewhere far beyond the ridgeline, inside a quiet room filled with screens and records older than most of the Marines standing here, a system had just noticed that someone who understood that kind of wind might still be alive. I could see the moment the weight of that radio call settled across the firing line. The Marines did not fully understand what the range officer meant by a system flag, but they understood the tone. It was the same tone that appears whenever something unusual moves through a chain of command. Quiet, careful, serious. Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez remained standing beside the bench with one hand resting on the orange rifle, his eyes no longer studying the paint or the scratched mark on the receiver, but studying me instead. The kind of look soldiers give when they realize a story might be walking around in front of them wearing ordinary clothes. The range officer spoke again into the radio, confirming the coordinates of the impact and repeating the distance of the shot in a slower voice this time, as if the numbers themselves might sound less unbelievable the second time they were spoken out loud. The breeze shifted across the range, and the wind flags fluttered gently again, their movement returning to the uneven rhythm that had confused the shooters earlier in the day. The valley had gone back to being complicated. I picked up the rifle and rested it against my shoulder while looking across the ridgeline, where the steel plate still rocked slightly under the afternoon sun. That target had already stopped meaning anything to me. The wind window was gone now. Another shot would not travel the same path. It never does. Behind me, one of the younger Marines finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Gunny, what kind of system flag are we talking about?" Ramirez did not answer immediately. His eyes were still on me, as if he were measuring something that did not show up on any scope or screen. Finally, he glanced toward the observation table where the range officer still hovered over the console. "The kind that means somebody upstairs noticed," he said calmly. The young Marine frowned slightly. "Noticed what?" Ramirez gestured toward the valley with a small tilt of his head. "A shot that should not exist." The Marines exchanged looks again. A few of them glanced down at their ballistic computers, as if the devices might suddenly explain the mathematics of what had happened. I had seen that reaction before too. When numbers fail, people look for authority. The radio crackled again, this time with a sharper voice on the other end asking for the shooter's name. The range officer hesitated before answering, his eyes drifting toward me the way someone glances toward a distant thunderstorm they are not sure is coming closer. "Shooter identity not logged," he replied carefully. "Civilian visitor present at the firing line." Ramirez exhaled slowly through his nose. "That will change soon," he muttered. I set the rifle down again and rested both hands lightly on the bench, letting the warmth of the wood settle into my palms. The desert air felt steady again now, the wind no longer lining up in that brief perfect corridor that had existed a few minutes earlier. The younger Marine stepped forward again, curiosity finally overpowering the hesitation in his voice. "Sir," he said, looking at me directly this time, "how did you know the wind would line up like that?" I looked out across the valley again and watched the mirage shimmer across the canyon walls. I did not know, I said calmly. I waited. Ramirez gave a small nod at that answer, the kind of nod that comes from someone who recognizes a lesson hidden inside a simple sentence. Before anyone else could speak, the radio on the table erupted again with a sharper transmission. The range officer straightened immediately and listened, his posture stiffening as the voice on the other end spoke longer this time. When he finally lowered the handset, he looked directly at Ramirez. "Gunny," he said carefully. "Range command wants the shooter to remain on site." Ramirez did not look surprised. "I figured." The officer continued, glancing once toward me again before finishing the message. "They are sending someone from base command to verify the data." A quiet murmur spread across the Marines again. The younger one whispered to his friend, "For one shot." Ramirez heard him. "Not for the shot," he said quietly while keeping his eyes on me. "For who made it?" The wind lifted again across the valley, rattling the wind flags and carrying the dry scent of dust across the range. I leaned slightly against the bench and watched the distant ridge where the steel plate had already stopped moving. The shot itself was finished, but something else had just begun moving through the system, something far slower than a bullet and far harder to stop once it started. And judging by the way the Marines were watching me now, they were beginning to understand that the most interesting part of the story had not even reached the firing line yet. The waiting began quietly, the kind of waiting that soldiers understand better than anyone else. It spread across the firing line without anyone needing to say it out loud. The Marines drifted back toward their scopes and benches, but nobody resumed shooting. The valley had already changed again, the wind sliding in uneven layers across the canyon walls, and every one of them understood that the moment for a shot like that had passed. I leaned against the wooden bench with the orange rifle resting lightly in my hands and watched the distant ridgeline through the shifting mirage. The steel plate had stopped moving now, hanging motionless against the rock as if the mountain itself had swallowed the sound of the impact. Behind me, Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez stood near the observation table with his arms crossed, speaking quietly with the range officer while the radio crackled with short bursts of confirmation traffic. I did not need to hear every word to understand the conversation. Once the system noticed something unusual, the questions always traveled upward through the chain of command like wind climbing a hillside. One of the younger Marines walked slowly toward the edge of the firing line and looked out across the valley, shaking his head slightly, as if the distance itself had offended him. "For 1,000 meters, he said under his breath. Another Marine answered quietly beside him. 2.5 miles. The words carried a different tone now, not disbelief, something closer to respect. Ramirez finished his conversation at the table and walked back toward me, the gravel crunching beneath his boots in a steady rhythm. He stopped beside the bench and looked down at the rifle again before glancing out toward the ridgeline where the shot had landed. "You ever shoot on this range before?" he asked. I shook my head. "First time." He studied my face for a moment as if comparing it against a memory he could not quite place. "You talk about wind like someone who spent a lot of years chasing it." I smiled faintly and looked out across the valley again where the mirage curled above the rocks like thin smoke rising from the earth. "The wind teaches slowly," I said, "but it never forgets." Ramirez nodded once, thoughtful now rather than skeptical. Before he could answer, the distant sound of rotors rolled across the desert from somewhere beyond the ridgeline. It started as a low vibration beneath the wind, barely noticeable at first, but every Marine on the firing line heard it within seconds. Heads turned automatically toward the sky, eyes scanning the bright afternoon horizon. The helicopter appeared a moment later, rising above the far ridge like a dark shape against the pale blue sky. It moved fast and straight toward the range, the steady thump of its rotors growing louder as it crossed the valley. One of the Marines let out a low whistle. "That is command traffic." Ramirez shaded his eyes with one hand and watched the aircraft approach. "Looks like it." The helicopter circled once above the range before descending toward the flat stretch of ground beyond the observation tower. Dust swirled outward as the landing skids touched down, the wind from the rotors sweeping across the firing line and snapping the range flags sharply to the east. The Marines instinctively stepped back from the benches, their attention shifting completely toward the landing zone. I stayed where I was, the rifle still resting lightly in my hands. Helicopters had a way of arriving when the story reached a certain point. Ramirez glanced at me again, curiosity mixed with something else now. You expecting company? He asked. I shook my head slowly. No. The rotors slowed slightly as the side door opened, and a uniformed officer stepped down onto the dusty ground, followed by another figure carrying a small tablet case. Even from a distance, the posture of the first man was unmistakable. Command presence moves differently than curiosity. The Marines on the firing line straightened instinctively, some of them adjusting their posture without even realizing they had done it. Ramirez exhaled quietly. That is not just a verification team, he said. I followed his gaze toward the landing zone where the officer was already walking toward the range with steady, deliberate steps. The wind shifted again across the valley, fluttering the flags and carrying the faint echo of the helicopter rotors back toward the ridgeline, where the steel plate still hung in silent confirmation of the shot that had started all of this. Ramirez looked back at me one more time, his eyes narrowing slightly as the realization finally settled in. Whatever that system flag was, he said quietly, it just brought someone important. I rested the rifle gently across the bench and watched the approaching figures move steadily closer through the swirling dust. The Marines around us had gone completely silent again, but this silence felt different from the one after the shot. That moment had been about the wind. This one was about identity. The dust from the helicopter was still drifting across the landing zone when the officer began walking toward the firing line, his pace steady and deliberate, the kind of walk that carries authority without needing to announce it. The Marines near the benches straightened instinctively as he approached, their conversations ending in mid-sentence as recognition spread quietly through the group. Even before he reached us, it was clear he was not just another officer from the base staff. The small silver stars on his collar caught the sunlight as he stepped out of the fading rotor wash, and the Marines along the line shifted their posture in unspoken acknowledgement. Major General Robert Callahan did not hurry as he crossed the gravel toward the observation table. He stopped briefly beside the range officer, exchanged a few quiet words, and glanced down at the console screen that still displayed the sensor reading from the distant steel plate. The officer beside him opened the tablet case he had carried from the helicopter and turned the screen so the general could see it. Callahan studied it for only a moment before his eyes lifted toward the valley and the ridgeline, where the plate hung nearly invisible in the afternoon light. Then he looked directly at me. The walk from the observation table to the firing line took only a few seconds, but the silence that followed him felt heavier than the quiet after the shot itself. Gunnery Sergeant Ramirez stepped aside automatically as the general approached the bench where the orange rifle rested. Callahan stopped in front of me and looked down at the rifle first, then at the thin scratched line beneath the worn paint on the receiver. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened with recognition. That mark, he said calmly, was not made recently. I shook my head once. No, sir. The general looked back, toward the ridgeline for a moment, as if measuring the distance with his own memory rather than the electronic readings on the tablet. For 1,000 meters, he said quietly. 2.5 miles. No one on the firing line moved. Even the wind seemed to slow as he turned his attention back to me. Name, he said. The question was simple, but every Marine standing nearby heard the weight behind it. I rested one hand lightly on the bench and answered just as simply. Daniel Carter. For a brief moment the valley was silent again. Then the general gave a small nod, as if confirming something he had already expected to find. He turned slightly toward the Marines gathered along the firing line and spoke in a voice calm enough to carry across the gravel and benches without effort. Gentlemen, he said, you just watched a man who has been studying wind longer than most of you have been alive. A few of the younger Marines exchanged stunned glances. Ramirez stood very still beside the bench, his earlier skepticism completely gone now. The officer holding the tablet stepped closer to the general and quietly displayed the information on the screen. Callahan glanced at it briefly and then looked back at the scratched line on the rifle receiver again. The archive recognized the trajectory profile, he said. There are only a handful of records that match it. He paused for a moment before continuing, his voice carrying a quiet respect now that had not been there when he first stepped off the helicopter. One of those records belongs to a Marine Corps sniper who set a range mark that stood untouched for decades. The Marines along the firing line shifted again, their expressions changing as the realization spread among them. Ramirez finally spoke, his voice careful. "Sir, are you saying—" Callahan nodded once before he could finish the question. "Yes." He looked directly at me again and extended his hand slowly, not as a formality, but as recognition. "Daniel Carter," he said, "the Marine who proved that wind is more patient than technology." I took his hand briefly and then let it go, the way old soldiers greet each other when words are not necessary. The general turned once more toward the Marines standing along the range. "Remember this moment," he told them calmly. "Computers help you measure the wind, but experience is what teaches you to wait for it." The wind flags fluttered again across the valley as if agreeing with him. I lifted the orange rifle from the bench and glanced one last time toward the distant ridgeline, where the steel plate hung motionless in the fading afternoon light. The wind had already moved on. It always does, but sometimes it leaves a lesson behind for those patient enough to listen.